We are, looking at a really complex phenomena, transition and detransition. People's self-understandings can change over time.
Even for those people who are really they have like a main answer to why they detransitioned. Even for those people there's usually like other factors that maybe they are not that relevant, but they also play a role.
Detransition is kind of an emerging socio-medical phenomenon. It's taken on a new meaning in our culture.
So I think regret was being used as a word to capture something quite infrequent at the time and that people didn't really understand.
And in those cases, I would say that regret isn't even strong enough a word to capture. And I would actually prefer to use words like harm, trauma, and be a lot more mindful of pretty significantly negative feelings about the medical transition.
Hello, everybody. I have two guests with me today, uh, Kinnon Ross MacKinnon and Pablo Exposito. Both are academic researchers in the field of gender, transition, healthcare, and detransition. This is a conversation we've been planning for quite a long time, and Kinnan, we have been in touch for quite a long time now, over a year. And Pablo, we haven't met before, so nice to meet
Hmm.
you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Thanks
So,
so much for having us, Alexander.
oh, you're welcome. We might actually start by I let you to introduce yourself and tell me more about the research you're working on and what sparked your interest in this particular field of study. Kenneth, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks again for the opportunity to come on and chat. As I was saying, I've watched a few of your videos, and I really appreciate your kind of objective to talk to a really wide range of people, and that's I feel like something that I aim to do in my research as well, like representing diverse voices. Yeah, so a little bit about me. So I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at York University in Toronto. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I'm trained in gender studies, social work, and public health sciences, actually. Um, and yeah, for about the last 10, 11 years, um, I've studied transgender medicine, the delivery of trans medicine, and how gender diverse people experience access to this area of medicine, more so as a social scientist.
And what sparked your particular interest in the transition in particular? Because quite a lot of your latest papers focus on that subject.
Right, yeah, and I'm sure we'll get pretty deep into the weeds of that research for sure. So yeah, I guess briefly before we move on to Pablo. So yeah, I'm also the principal investigator of the DARE study, which stands for Detransition Analysis, Representation, and Exploration. Um, and it is a binational study examining the experiences of detransition, retransition, and identity fluidity amongst Americans and Canadians. And yeah, for the last, I'm going to say it's going into 4 or 5 years now. I've really been thinking about the topic of detransition. I can get a little bit more into my story into detransition, maybe after we hear a bit from Pablo in terms
Of
of his
course.
intro.
Yes. So, Pablo, tell us a bit more about your research and background.
Yeah. First of all, it's very nice to be here. I've
Pleasure.
watched a few of your videos as well, and it's really nice to have an opportunity to talk. So I'm from Spain. My background is in psychology, clinical psychology. Um, I'm a psychologist. I have also a background in philosophy of science and gender studies, so I'm a bit interdisciplinary as well, like Kinnon. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing research in this field, trying to understand how we can support trans people and detransitioners from a psychological point of view. So my research right now, I'm in my last year of PhD, and I'm just, I'm just trying to understand how trans people and detransitioners are similar and different in their life experiences and their needs, and how we can use that information to come up with new ways of supporting and caring for trans people and people who detransition. So yeah, briefly, that's my story.
Okay, regarding one thing you said there, that you focus on finding out what kind of similarities there are between trans people and detransitioners. Do you think, what would you say are common challenges that both a trans person and a detransitioner could face?
Well, I think so far from my experience with the people I've talked to, I would say the challenges and the experiences that they have are quite similar because both have transitioned. And I think during transition, many people go through the same kind of things and the same kind of challenges. It's true that some people, have a better time, for example, in with other people, or don't ever experience, for example, violence. Other people do. But I haven't found any kind of pattern or trend or any kind of observation that made me think that they are that different. And this may also have to do with the fact that my sample is not very big, it's quite small. But so far, my feeling is that based on how trans people and detransitioners go through transition, it's not very easy to identify what the outcomes will be in the future. I don't know if that answers your question.
Uh, would you think it's because the reasons people transition are similar among both people who detransition and those who don't detransition? And I guess I'll direct this question to both of you. So whichever one wants to answer first, please go ahead.
Do you want to go first, Keenan?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic for sure. The question of trans, detrans experiences, because it's such a heterogeneous, diverse group of people, and I feel like everyone has an individual experience of their identity and of gender dysphoria and ideas about their goals that bring them to pursue transition. And similarly, we also see a lot of divergence in the reasons why people may detransition, may choose to detransition. And so we are, looking at a really complex phenomena, transition and detransition. And I think what's also makes it quite difficult to understand and unpack both phenomena is that people's self-understandings can change over time. So one thing that I have, yeah, I mean, at this moment, we don't have a lot of great longitudinal data with a general trans population, and we certainly don't have longitudinal data with detrans populations. And what I would be personally curious to study, this is not a study that I'm, currently planning or anything, but as I'm talking, I'm thinking about it. Interviewing people at the time they're pursuing transition, then maybe 5 or 10 years later, how might their story and understanding of their transition shift and change over time? And from engaging with a lot of detrans people over the years, I also have an inkling that that may be true, that people's story of their journeys actually it can also change over time. We make meaning of our lives through social relations and also by engaging with the social context and discourse and ideas and so forth.
Yeah, this is quite interesting because some of the people I've talked to were quite explicit about what Kinnon mentioned. For example, they told me, at the time I was transitioning, I thought that this was the reason driving me to transition. But now I think this was the real factor that brought me to this path. So I think it's quite important to bear in mind that people change and evolve in the way they think about their lives and how they make sense of things. And I think from a psychological point of view, everything tends to be multifactorial. So there's never one single factor affecting a decision that you make in your life. And from my experience, there's sometimes a cascading effect. So there something happens, and this something triggers another thing in the life of a person. So there's like a contribution of different things that are going on, and all of these factors bring the person to detransition or to transition.
This, probably what you just said, definitely goes in a similar direction that I'm also covering in the book I'm writing. Because one thing I really discovered is that both the phenomenon of transition and detransition can't really be understood as a result of one specific singular factor, but more like a collection of ones. So, and all the people you have talked to, is this what you usually observed, that there are like multiple factors that lead to someone to make a decision to either transition or detransition?
Yeah, that's my experience. Yeah, there's usually a mix of different factors. So even for those people who are really, they have like a main answer to why they detransitioned. Even for those people, there's usually like other factors that maybe they are not that relevant, but they also play a role. For example, someone who detransitions because they are not feeling well mentally and they are not in a good place, but they also think, or they also say, for example, that they were so tired of taking injections, or they were so tired of going to the hospital, or taking the medication, or they were feeling not very well physically, but the main reason was mental health, but there are other things going on as well. And yeah, this is pretty much what I've seen in most of the people I've talked to. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
I would, yeah, and I would add to that in the sense of, oh, sorry, Alex, I think Alexander, may have missed
No,
that
no,
what you
please
said.
go first.
Okay. Yeah, so I was going to add on to what Pablo's sharing. So, in the first study that I led, which is the Read Detrans Canada study, which was a smaller study than the DARE study, um, we interviewed 28 individuals who related to an experience of either detransition or retransition. And, similar, no one had one factor for the reason that they, started shifting their transition. And not all of these people would actually identify themselves as being detransitioners, but they may have encountered surgical complications, a decline in mental health. Some were feeling, for instance, maybe, and this was a bit more, came out more in the trans masculine people who detransitioned back to female. Some of them disclosed that they had actually been living basically stealth in very male dominated roles. And didn't feel good about where they had ended up, and they felt quite constrained in that gender role. And that was also part of the reason for wanting to make a change. Some of them also mentioned in interviews that they had actually started to, in private, in the privacy of their own homes, basically exploring different gender presentation again, sort of like almost similar to the way that they would have explored gender in their initial transition. Um, but yeah, there's such a wide variety of stories,
Hmm.
but I completely agree that rarely have I encountered someone who would describe their detransition as due to a singular factor.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. You know, the way I see it, I think we can think of it in like three different categories, and that is the main factor, contributing factors, and the catalyst as for
Mm,
why transition or detransition happens. And while I think that both the main factor and the contributing factors are often psychological, the catalyst is usually some sort of external event. And as far as transition is concerned, we hear very often that the internet, the social media, or this type of social contagion is the reason young people are transitioning these days, when in fact I think we should be thinking of it as a sort of catalyst that allows for those factors to um, transform into action, basically.
yeah, I
Yeah.
would agree with
That.
that. I think sorry, Pablo, I'll just be quick here. Um, I agree. I think, I mean, our world today, information is shared via social media. And so I also would kind of push back on the framing that, social media is like the cause of a social contagion around trans. Historically, we would have learned about trans people also on maybe the internet, but not social media or just in LGBTQ communities. So it's just that the technology through which this information is being shared has changed in our modern world.
Pablo, you wanted to add something. So.
Yeah. I thought that your idea about these like three different categories, this is quite interesting because it aligns with how we think about things in psychology. For example, we talk about predisposing factors and precipitating factors. So when there's a precipitating factor, you have to look at predisposing factors because you need to understand what's been going on in that person's life in order for that event to bring about something. In this case, we are talking about transition, but you need to look at different places in order to understand what's going on, not only to what caused this decision to become real.
Kinnon, I want to go back to something you said early on about this shift in the way a person understands themselves and their own transition. Do you think that the shift is actually in the way the person understands themselves and their gender, or do you think that this is an actual shift in someone's gender identity on a metaphysical level? And I'm asking this as someone who both had a personal experience of detransitioning, but also someone who studied philosophy and has like this huge interest in the things relating to identity and consciousness. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. The first thing I would like to say is that I am not a philosophy buff, so that's a limitation in my own knowledge. So I will admit that first. you know what I think is important is to first take a step back and maybe clarify what we even mean by detransition, and maybe some of the debates that are happening around defining detransition, how Pablo and I define detransition, and then we could get to your question. Um,
Yes.
and I think it might maybe the first important thing to just acknowledge here is that detransition is kind of an emerging socio-medical phenomenon. It's taken on a really a new meaning in our culture, in our communities. And I feel like the way that detransition is defined is going to differ based on whether you're talking to a clinician, a researcher, a trans person, someone who has experience of detransition. And there really isn't broad consensus among these groups. And that makes it the first challenge from a research perspective, but even just to know whether we are even talking about the same thing when we are discussing this, the topic here together. Um, so there's that piece that I think is important to kind of put front and center. Personally, as a researcher who's been started studying this phenomena, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I do focus on the identity change component. So I do differentiate between, say, a trans person who stops hormones for, various reasons, such as, they can't afford access, or they've had health complications, or any side effects, any other reasons why people might stop hormones, but still have no change in their identity. They still understand themselves as being a trans person. Um, where I would start to be more interested in detransition phenomena is if someone has had kind of a change in how they understand or conceptualize their sex, their gender, identity or gender expression, and their sexual orientation. And that shift, that kind of internal shift in their psychology, may prompt a desire for a change in their embodiment or their body. It may change, it may prompt stopping hormones. It may prompt a desire for even reversal procedures like breast reconstruction, and or regret over the interventions, the impact of the interventions on the body. And so that's where I start to be more curious about, and start to actually label that as like something as a detransition related phenomena. So I am interested in the kind of identity shift component, but maybe Pablo could add as to the kind of thinking around studying detransition, because this is something that we've really, as researchers, we're really struggling with right now.
Yeah, yeah, I pretty much agree with it. I think the identity shift is quite like the key component for me and for us because we work together and we've been discussing this over and over. And it's been quite difficult to, for example, when we want to write something, it's quite complicated to come up with a definition that is inclusive of all the things that can be understood nowadays as detransition, because there's no consensus and people talk about many different things when they talk about detransition. Some people are really restrictive and they, for example, think about detransition as going back. So, for example, having some sort of reversal surgery, for example. And other people talk about, for example, have a mental shift in the way you think about yourself. So, for example, you don't even need to do anything about your gender expression or even your name, but you change the way you see yourself and you relate to others and to the world. So, and I think this is one of the main, the lack of a coherent definition is one of the main problems and one of the main drivers of this confusion about the numbers. Because when people talk about numbers in detransition research, some people are talking about hormone discontinuation, some other people are talking about regret, other people are talking about reversal surgeries, for example. Other people are talking about identifying as a detransitioner, So there's a lot of confusion, and Kinnon and I have been thinking about this idea of detransition as more like an umbrella term, like trans as an umbrella term. Detransition, right now can be understood as an umbrella as well, because there are so many ways that people think about this term, relate to this term, or even apply it to themselves, that it's quite difficult to stick to a definition, because if you stick only to one definition, you risk excluding some people who don't see themselves in that definition, but may have some sort of experience that can be understood as relating to the transition in some way.
Oh, that's a very interesting thought. I think the biggest challenge with defining what detransition is, I think, is that if you go like too narrow, if you really narrow it down to one specific thing, you are excluding a lot of people who may not fall into that particular experience. But I think also, if you make it too broad, it becomes sort of an undefined mess, if you know what I mean, because
Hmm.
someone who let's say stops taking hormones, let's say it's a biological male, is stops taking estrogen to maybe freeze the semen samples before any surgery, such as orchiectomy, and then goes back on those same hormones when that is done. It's not necessarily in the same category as someone who we might think of as classical detransitioner, right? Someone who
Hmm.
regrets their transition and goes back to identifying as their bio sex and
Hmm.
live. That's the social role of that sex, right? Like they don't really have that much in common that it can be understood under one specific definition. So maybe it is a good idea to think of it as sort of as an umbrella, but I also think we can't really have one specific definition for all of it.
Yeah, do you know what? I fully agree, and I would say that as a as a trans person and a researcher, I actually have really struggled, and I feel so conflicted because on the one hand, um, I really aim to kind of respect people's self-understanding, their identities, the labels that they like that they use for themselves. And as a kind of human, as a trans person in community, this is how these are my beliefs, my values. At the same time, I'm conflicted as a researcher who, I do like to have a little bit cleaner definition and to have a little bit better, more defined sense as to what I'm studying. If I'm, I am in a position of trying to build knowledge about this phenomena that we're starting to see rise in our community and in our culture. And I do feel it's important to have a bit more of a sense as to what we're studying. So a lot of my work has involved um, consulting with, doing interviews with, and collecting qualitative data with a really broad range of people with these experiences that we're talking about to have start to develop a better sense of the construct, better sense of language. But at the same time, I feel actually quite personally pulled and challenged in the sense of ultimately, as a researcher, we do have to draw some boundaries, and unfortunately, that will not please everyone. So that's something that I've kind of struggled with. But honestly, these problems are coming from really, in part, the academic literature. So Pablo talked a little bit about these like very narrow definitions. So um, the way that clinicians have historically defined, really regret and essentially detransition, have been quite muddled. There hasn't been a lot of clarity for decades. And in some cases, the reason that we have such low prevalence in terms of estimating like the frequency of detransition, it's because researchers themselves have made these decisions to basically say that, regret only involves the people who return to their same surgeon requesting reversal surgeries, or have legally reversed their gender markers. As we all know, I probably don't need to go into a lot of detail here, that that misses a lot of people who have experiences that we would probably understand as being detransition.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, even I wouldn't fall into that specific definition, considering I haven't had any reconstructive surgeries
Hmm.
post my transition, or after I have detransitioned. So I can definitely see what you mean there. Actually, something Macy Bowers said, I think, uh, is that she didn't see that many people going back to her to
Hmm.
have those reconstructive surgeries. So that was sort of her conclusion as to why detransition must probably never really happen. And I'm thinking that's such a restrictive way of viewing it. But historically, detransition has always been something that's been tied to regret, right? And as someone who lives in Norway, it is very interesting to me that we still technically don't have a word for detransition. We just call it regret here. There is no detransition in Norway, and I've been sort of trying to change that, trying to make the term detransition sort of more mainstream, because I don't think
Hmm.
regret is what primarily characterizes the transition, even if there is a
Hmm.
portion of the transitioners who do regret, and I think a lot of that has like partial regret but not complete. I think most detransitioners will actually fall into this category of partial regret. What are your
Hmm.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that um, the word regret, according to the older clinicians, they also used it in a really mixed and heterogeneous way. So regret, per the older clinicians, also didn't necessarily refer to an actual feeling of having, wish that you made a different decision with regards to your transition. So it was applied to talk about legal reversal, like illegal gender status reversal. It was applied to individuals who seem to basically not regret their transition, but shift their gender expression. And so maybe they might have been shifting to maybe non-binary, or just, it's very complicated. And I guess just another side point, one of the reasons why I started researching this topic was because I realized that the only research that had ever been conducted historically on detransition was always from the lens of the clinician. And so there actually wasn't any community engaged or kind of patient perspective research on detransition. I felt that was really short-sighted and really missing from the literature.
So I just wanted to add to something that Kinnon mentioned about the older literature, because if you read some of the older articles, it's quite interesting to see how they call regret things that even the mere definition that they give doesn't imply regret at all. So I think regret was being used as a word to capture something quite infrequent at the time and that people didn't really understand. They used to use other terms such as, for example, gender role reversal. That was quite common as well. But right now, I think it's quite important to distinguish both detransition and regret. I think this is becoming more clear. But from what I've seen and from the people I've talked to, I would say the most common feeling is ambivalence. I think ambivalence is quite common. For example, feeling satisfied with some aspects of transition, or feeling that you wouldn't change some things that you did, but wishing that you've made a different decision with regards to other aspects of transition, or feeling, for example, satisfied with something but regretful of other things, or, for example, feeling that you appreciate the opportunity to transition, but now you feel like transition was not the best decision for you. So I would say ambivalence is quite common. Along with, of course, there's regret, like clear regret, but I would say ambivalence is not that much talked about, and I think it's quite important to understand how many people feel as well.
Thank you for
Yeah, I
this.
want to add what I want to add. I just want to add one point there. So yeah, I completely agree. Regret as an emotion does not fully capture the experience. Um, but the other point I wanted to say, and this is, Pablo, maybe we have different samples, and so and we've spoken to different people. I would say that it kind of that for individuals who've sustained really serious medical complications, and I would say specifically serious surgical complications, um, that is where the experiences and feelings may actually diverge. And in those cases, I would say that regret isn't even strong enough a word to capture. And I would actually prefer to use words like harm, trauma, and be a lot more mindful of pretty significantly negative feelings about the medical transition.
Uh,
Um, and yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
stole
that's
that
a really
right out of
important
my
point.
mouth because I was just about to add it myself, Kinnon. Um,
Mm.
but yes,
Yeah,
uh,
oh, sorry. Yeah,
if yeah, please go
yeah,
ahead, Pablo.
yeah. I've had that in my sample as well. Like people with very very serious regret, and with feelings of yeah, I would say trauma, or feeling harmed, but by transition. So yeah, of course.
Regarding the trauma, because yeah, this is the word I also tend to use. I agree with you, Kinnon, 100% that regret is not a 100% accurate word to describe this type of trauma. Um,
Mhm.
but also, I don't think this type of trauma is exclusive to detransitioners alone, because a lot of people who don't detransition may have the same complications from surgery, which can also happen
Mhm.
to trans people who don't detransition. And this is sort of a trauma that can be shared, right? I think
Mhm.
it's interesting why this sort of trauma may lead some people to detransition, but not others. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, sure. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Alexander. And yeah, I think it is, this is an important piece to kind of elaborate on. Um, yeah, I completely agree. So, actually my first experiences, of kind of working in, gender affirming healthcare, trans medicine was back in 2014, actually. Before I started my PhD, I was a social worker, and I was a group facilitator for actually the first ever lower surgery support group for trans men in Canada. It was here in Toronto, but I was actually very early in transition at the time, and I was tasked with, I guess, supporting trans men who were kind of in the process of recovering from lower surgeries. And with that group was quite eye-opening for me as a young person. I was in my late 20s then. But a lot of there was a very plain, open discussion of a lot of medical trauma in that group. And actually, that was part of why I decided to focus my research on improving gender affirming healthcare. But yeah, once I started to research detransition, um, I was, of course, reminded of my earlier support group work, and encountering once again, people who felt, um, quite harmed, or in some cases, wishing they had had a better experience in the healthcare system, frustration with the body, really wide, when we are earlier in pursuing these interventions, our ideas and hopes and dreams, a lot of our hopes and dreams really rest on these interventions, and the reality can be quite different from our initial thinking when we pursue the treatments. And of course, we hope that we have a positive outcome. But this is why I really take my role as a researcher quite seriously, because I think that researchers have a really big role to identify where problems may be occurring and search for, with our data, search for kind of better solutions and improvements in our healthcare.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Pablo?
Yeah. You know, when we started talking, you asked if I had seen differences between or similarities between trans people and detransitioners. And there's something that I saw that was very similar between both groups of people, which was having bad encounters with health care providers, or having bad experiences with surgeons, for example, having a really bad experience of surgery or certain treatment. And going to your question, why some people detransition and why some other people don't, I think here we have to go back to what we mentioned about all the other contributing factors. Because from my own, conversations with people, I've seen that some of the trans people that had these really bad experiences, they have a good or a positive transition experience overall. And some of the detransitioners that had a really bad health experience, they are not feeling really well, or there are some other things going on in their lives that are not making transition a good experience overall. So I think that we need to go back to this idea that everything's multifactorial, and these might be behind why some people detransition and why some other people don't, even though they have the same kind of bad or negative experiences with, for example, surgery.
That's an interesting take. Almost, uh, almost makes you think that the reason people detransition has actually more to do with experience. I mean, I think there are individuals who genuinely transition for the wrong reasons and would come to detransition at some point, no matter what. But I also think there are a lot of cases that exist in the gray zone, where whether someone goes on to continue living as a trans person or the detransition is based purely on the experience they had in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have another emotion and term that we haven't talked about yet is grief. And so I wonder if that's a little bit of what you're speaking to, Alexander. And I think that this can occur um, with people who transition and don't detransition. If, for instance, there's frustration as to the physical outcomes of various interventions. Having to grieve the idea of who you thought you might become through transition, or having to contend with the reality that, for instance, when I first started transitioning, I thought I'd have a full beard by 6 months on T, and that didn't happen for me. And, over the many years, I've accepted that as a fact of life. At the same time, with people who some people who've sustained serious complications, or maybe even who have deep regret over the transition but decide not to detransition, there is also a grieving process that individuals may have to go through in terms of kind of reaching acceptance as to the outcome, the life that one has, and then similarly with people who who detransition and also have regret, there can also be a grieving process that people go through in terms of going through the stages of grief around denial, acceptance, and moving on.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
actually, I always used to think that there's stages of grief are just
Mm,
simply wrong, that most people don't actually go through them. It's just a stereotype. But then when you actually
mm,
go through it, it's like, yeah, you start with denial. That was
mm,
definitely the case for me. Um, Pablo,
mm,
you mentioned numbers earlier
Hmm.
regarding that people who just go off hormones are also sometimes being counted as the cases of detransition and that it affects those numbers. And in regards of the research of how many people actually detransition, do you think we have any sufficient knowledge to make such statements that is 40% or 1%, let's say?
Yeah. I think at this moment we don't have any good numbers we can rely on to confidently say that we have X percentage of detransitioners. And I think the main issue goes back to what we mentioned about not having good definitions, not having a consensus. So we can really compare the numbers coming from one study to the numbers coming from another study. Because if they are using different definitions, then it's like comparing apples and oranges. You are not comparing the same thing, right?
Absolutely.
Um, I can say that 1% is not I believe that this number is coming from another era where research was being done and there were a fewer number of people transitioning. I would say that numbers are higher than that, but we don't have any real good numbers right now. Um, we have, for example, some studies saying it's 6%, it's 10%, it's 4%. I think it's probably around the range of between 1 and 10. I would say that's a safe range. But as I said, um, these numbers are not comparable. And there's also something that I wanted to add. Because I think this is a really important topic in research. We mentioned that all the studies are using different definitions. I think this is really important to bear in mind because if you use a specific definition, then you are only reaching and sampling a subgroup of people within those who detransition. So the conclusions that you can make based on their experiences may not be generalizable to other people. So I think we can clearly see that happening in this field when, for example, we have a study saying, hey, the transitioners are these people and they feel this way. And then we have another study saying, no, they are these people and they feel this way. They are probably part of the same population, but these studies are reaching different subsets of the people because of the way they define the transition or, things like that.
Yeah, it's almost like you place a camera at a specific spot in the room at a specific angle, and
Yeah.
you're looking at this whole picture, and then you place another camera in a different spot. Well, it's the same place, but you get a completely different picture, right? So,
hmm
yeah, I can definitely see that. I also think that because the number of transitions has gone up, then automatically the number of people who detransition actually does go up as well. What I think is really more interesting is the relations between those numbers of people who transition and people who detransition. The percentage, whether that percentage has actually grown in the last years, and if so, why?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I completely agree. So, I mean, for sure, the absolute numbers of people who eventually may detransition would increase just by sheer mirroring the dramatic increase of people who've started transitioning the last 10 years. Um, the other piece is, yeah, like, so right now, there's one research study that was done in the United States that found that roughly 30% of trans people discontinued their hormonal treatments, basically didn't refill their hormonal prescriptions. And this is a study that actually, it just looked at, the portion of people who didn't refill their prescription. And this is a study that has been, circulated online by many different actors, and it's caused a lot of confusion. I saw a journalist one day on Twitter saying that 30% of people detransition. I've seen, some people involved in the kind of, culture war issue saying that, potentially 30% detransition because of that single study. But I think it's really important that we understand how these studies were designed and what are their limits, like what can we actually take from that study. And I would say that for every study on detransition, for exactly what Pablo's talking about, every study is using a different definition. And the DARE study, the study that we have our first paper that's coming out actually, probably in the next couple of months. And we put in a really big effort to try to address and mitigate some of those problems that exist in the research study, which is by collecting data from a really wide range of people who have these experiences. So, we put in our best effort to collect data from, people who have all kinds of different positions, different ideological perspectives, who come from different communities, and so forth, in order to try to build much more comprehensive knowledge around these experiences. So our first paper coming out is actually it discusses some of these problems that exist in the academic literature that we're talking about. And even as all of us probably know, and Alexander, you probably speak to, personally, the trans, detrans communities are very polarized online. And so there's a lot of kind of infighting, political dynamics, and really kind of nasty feelings as well, and debates that are happening. They're quite uncomfortable. So we really tried to kind of reach past all of those dynamics to include a really diverse group.
It's very interesting for me to observe that kind of dynamic online, because when it comes to my personal life and my own personal relationships with trans people, at least in most cases, doesn't really have that same dynamic, which really makes me think that there's this really strong polarization going on there, which doesn't really make it easier for us to actually understand each other, have this empathy for each other and our experiences as both detransitioners and trans people. But both of you have been about this idea of building this bridge. And both of you have also written about trying to understand the phenomenon of detransitioner. Pablo, you wrote a paper on the typology of detransition, in which you also stated that it is a phenomenon that needs to be understood. And Kinnon, you wrote also a paper on how detransition needs more understanding and less controversy. And I really liked what you said in Kinnon. I think it was an interview at New York Times. Detransition is a human experience that needs to be understood. Do you think that if it is understood better, that there is some chance of that bridge being actually built in the online sphere as well?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing and what we're talking about here in terms of the polarization it is, doesn't only affect trans and detrans. This is just like a microcosm of our society and what's happening on social media around polarization in general. Um, I'm so I'm a bit cynical about the possibilities for online, bridge building, because
You're not the
I
only
think
one,
social
trust
media, the
me.
way that it's
Yeah.
I think social media is designed to divide, and I think that the way that algorithms function, I'm not sure that we will have bridge building in the online space. But similar to you, Alexander, like, I came out 20 years ago. My whole community is LGBTQ. My colleagues, my friends, most of my friends are trans, non-binary, and I have friends who've detransitioned as well. And in my personal life, I have, very good relationships with all of these groups of people. And I've had many really amazing and transformative conversations with detransitioners of all different values and experiences with gender affirming healthcare on Zoom in a one-on-one conversational dynamic. So I think in the real world, the bridges already exist. I think those bridges exist, and maybe more conversation could be happening in person and within our LGBTQ organizations. And that's something that I'm really advocating for, is LGBTQ organizations to start to acknowledge and support people who've detransitioned. Um, but yeah, I'm a little bit more cynical about the possibilities for social media. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I agree with you. I think the more we move this conversation away from the online sphere, even though this conversation is happening online right now, but yeah, I agree with you that it needs to be sort of organized. And I think most LGBTQ organizations, like I said, should include and acknowledge us in our specific challenges. But from my experience is that, and I think it also differs from place to place and from organization to organization. We have an LGBTQ organization here in Norway who has taken a lot of interest in the transition, but there are a lot of organizations who actually exclude us completely, don't want to talk to us or about us or act like we don't exist. That is quite a challenge. What do you think has to be changed there? And Pablo, do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm. Yeah, I agree with Kinnon, and I think this debate we have all the time about numbers is distracting us a lot from the fact that these are real people with real experiences and they need real help. So it doesn't really matter if it's only 1%, if it's 10%, because no matter the magnitude of this phenomenon, we need to organize care to support and care for all the people going through this experience. So I think this big focus on numbers is distracting us from something that's more important, in my opinion. And from my experience, I could say that many people in real life, when you talk face to face to someone, many people are really compassionate and they are really interested in trying to understand what's going on and how they can be of help. So, for example, I've talked to so many people who are, they are supporting gender affirming care, and they are really open to talking about detransition, and they are really open to trying to learn how they can do their jobs better and how they can care for people going through these, experiences. So I think that we need more, real life, face to face conversations, trying to be open minded, trying to talk to everyone, trying not to be closed to talking to people with different views, because there's always some ground of understanding. I think this is really important. Yeah, we need to start, creating dialogue and trying to, trying to forget about all these, in my opinion, futile debates about so many things and trying to focus on what's important, which is care and support for people who detransition, because yeah, many people need a lot of help.
Yeah, those are in very, very interesting thoughts and almost a great way to conclude here. Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the time, when people talk about the 1%, right, it feels that it's less about the actual research and more about saying that our experiences don't matter. That has been the case in
Hmm.
my experience a lot of the time, at least.
Yeah, and I kind of chuckled there because Pablo and I named our Substack the 1% in a kind of
Actually,
tongue-in-cheek way, because
can I interrupt you here? If
yeah,
I'm talking to the viewers right now, not for
yeah,
you.
yeah.
But if you guys are interested to hear more from these two, they have an amazing Substack. They post like almost weekly there. A lot of interesting stuff you can read on this topic. It's also very easily digestible. So if you do not like reading academic paper, they are a little more accessible. So please go ahead, check their Substack. I'm going to leave the link to their Substack under the video, along with some link to some of their papers that you can read. There you go.
Thanks for the plug, Alexander. Yeah, so I was going to say we have had a few questions as to why we called it the 1%. We are planning to do a post about that, but the 1% is, it's used. I agree with you. I think it's used to kind of minimize or say, this isn't really an important topic. And to me, and I think this is because I've been around trans medicine for so long and trans activism. In the early days, you know, we used to, trans people as a population were estimated to be 1% or less. And actually, some of the early trans activism around expanding access to gender affirming healthcare, a lot of that work, and this is, I guess, relates to the philosophy of science, it also challenged, there was a lot of work to challenge the idea that trans people are, less than 1% of the population. And there was a lot of critiquing of the older research designs that people would argue at the time underestimated the size of the trans population. And then from that discourse, we saw a lot of kind of expansion of what trans and transitioning means. And so I feel like in some ways we are actually living through that period again with regards to detransition. So as you can say from some of the conversations, we are, wondering, what's the percentage here? How do we define detransition? Is it an umbrella term? Does it include more people than we previously thought? So it's just like, kind of I feel like we're kind of going back in time here. But some of the same questions have come up again with regards to detransition.
Definitely, definitely. I think that in terms of transition, I think that the fact that there have been more trans people who are visible also made a lot more people sort of open up and come out. And I think it's the same
Hmm.
with the transition. I think it's something we are becoming more comfortable talking about rather than
Hmm.
keeping it quiet, because I think that has been the case for a very long time, that a lot of people have just been quiet about it. And it's almost like a
100%.
revolution happening somewhat. I'm also thinking sometimes whether the fact that we are seeing more detransitioners doesn't necessarily have to do with the fact that there are more of us, but rather that we are more open to talk about it. One final question to both of you before we finish. Um, a lot of the time, people talk about what the trans community or LGBTQ community can do better for detransitioners, but considering all the extensive research both of you have done, what would you say is something that detransitioners should do better in this whole conversation with trans community?
Hmm.
Hmm.
A really good question.
That's a thinker. I'm not, you know what? I think I would, that's really hard. I'm not sure. I feel like you've stumped me.
Sorry
Um,
about that.
because I guess I feel that trans people and detransitioners like have a right to their experiences and to share their experiences, even if that makes people uncomfortable. I would say that with regards to trans people transitioning and detransition. And so I don't think it's fair necessarily to say that detransitioners should be a different way. Just like I would say that I don't think that trans people necessarily need to be a different way. What I would say, and I feel like maybe the underlying question or some of the underlying discourse that I'm thinking about with regards to tensions between trans and detrans people online, I think that's more to do with algorithms, sensationalization, um, the way that certain stories are kind of blown up in the media or on, maybe in outraged content on social media. And I think that is the source of the real problems. It's not the experiences, it's just the way they're being politically positioned and I
Frame.
think are, yeah, framed. Yeah, yeah. I don't know, but I'd love to hear from Pablo.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
Uh,
So,
yeah, I feel the same way. One of the questions that I asked many of my participants, for trans people, for example, I asked them, would you ever detransition? Have you ever considered that? And for detransitioners, I asked the opposite question, would you ever consider transitioning again? And many of them were really open to, trans people were really open to talking to the transitioners and trying to understand their perspectives and their experiences and their needs. And they even told me, hey, I would like to talk to someone because I would really like to know why and what happened, you know so I think we go back to this idea that in real life things are so different, and I think people are really open to learning about what happened to others and why others experienced things the way they did.
Hmm.
And I think maybe my thought would be that I think it's really important that both trans people and detransitioners have a space where they can share what happened to them and they can really control the narrative, because I think that nowadays there's a lot of power struggles between different actors to control narratives around trans people and detransitioners. And I think it's really important for both groups to have their safe spaces where they can really control and can really share what happened to them without the fear that their experiences are going to be weaponized or are going to be used or are going to be, positioned in a way that they don't really intend it in the first place. So I agree with Kinnon that the problem is how things are being framed by all the people who have no stakes, um, because maybe they are not trans people, they are not detransitioners, or they are not even providers. Yeah, but I think this is a really good question. I would need to think more about that.
but that's a very interesting perspective, and I agree with what you said there, Pablo, because a lot of the time I have noticed that I guess it's still the case, maybe less so these days, because I think there's a change going on with the voices of the transitioners. But until now, it has been the case that the narrative of the transition has been driven either by the anti-trans groups or by the trans community or LGBT organizations. A lot of the time, this narrative hasn't been told by us, and even when we are asked about it, it often gets framed in a certain way. And again, one thing I've really noticed with the media, that's since I came out publicly and have been interviewed, at first my intention wasn't really to just talk about it so the experience is understood, and I really wanted others who go through that same experience to not feel alone. Really, that was always my motivation at the core. Like you're not the only one. Um, and one thing I've noticed is that yeah, well, it doesn't really matter what my motivation is because if you go to the media, they will frame it in a certain way that tells us a certain agenda. There's definitely like a political move there, which is quite unfortunate, really. But,
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we, as academics and researchers, we have to take responsibility as well, because the way we research this topic, it's going to contribute to the narrative around the transition as well. So I think it's really important for us to be neutral, to be open to all the range of different perspectives and feelings and emotions and needs and experiences that people have, and try to convey all those different experiences in a neutral way so that we really, I think we need to convey the idea that this is a complex phenomenon, and we need to tolerate this complexity, and we need to be comfortable with that in order to understand what's going on and why some people detransition and what they need. And so we need to take responsibility as well with the way we research this topic.
great. Thank you, both of you, for finding the time to come over to my channel and talk to me. I think it was very, very valuable, and I really appreciate it. And I hope the viewers appreciate it too.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.